Hi everybody, a really warm welcome to my channel, Nelly the Narcissist. Thank you so much for joining today. I'm not a narcissist. That is the most important information to know if you are new. Nelly is the character that I portray in my comedy skits. If you haven't seen those, I'm going to link them down below in the description box. Now you may have noticed I'm not holding a microphone today because I have a new addition to my audio team. My hands are free and I'm hoping that this little device is going to serve me well and deliver better audio quality to my recordings. So as many of you know, in these podcasts, I look at NPD through a spiritual lens, not just the psychology, because I believe there is much more to it. And what's not often spoken about, hardly at all actually, is the spiritual battle that takes place within these narcissistic relationships. And like many of you found out, there is a covert darkness going around trying to take people out, and unfortunately succeeding too often. And this was my motivation to start the channel, to get the word out. So in this podcast today, I was actually inspired by a video that I recently saw about the development of NPD through childhood trauma. And it was a talk by Tim Fletcher. By the way, I really like the work of Tim Fletcher, and I think that, he's got a huge amount of wisdom and value to share on the topic of complex trauma. So I got nothing against him whatsoever. But obviously, there are clinical approaches that offer us certainly loads of information, but they don't give us all the information. And why? Because they're not giving the spiritual level any acknowledgement. So I want to talk about Tim's video in this podcast, and I want to share my spiritual thoughts on how I believe that narcissists, psychopaths, narcopaths are created. Because even though there are many points that I agree with Tim and clinical approaches, I'm not against it. I agree for a lot. But where they draw a line, I know there's more. Where they want to give a clinical justification, I'm like, wait a second. What you just said doesn't hold up, because what about this or what about that? So I want to speak about all of these discrepancies that I personally have with the ideas that NPD and psychopathy is born out of trauma and genetics alone, whilst ignoring the spiritual factor. Many people, they don't believe that the spiritual dimension of life exists, and that's okay. And probably my videos aren't going to be for you, but if you had an experience with a narcissist or narcopath that made you aware of the spiritual level, then this will probably be an interesting discussion point for you. And if you resonate with today's video, then please do like it, share it with anybody that you think it might help, and drop me a comment below. Thank you. So in Tim's very good discussion in this video, he spoke about how narcissists and psychopaths are formed due to their childhood traumatic environments and not ever being given healthy coping mechanisms by their caregivers. And I'm out on a walk and I'm listening to this video and I'm thinking, right, yeah, absolutely true. They were unable to cope with their experience. They were, after all, only children, and it was a lot for them. So Tim said that the only way to survive for a narcissist or psychopath in their childhood was to basically shut down. And so they didn't just disassociate from the scene for protection, but, they shut down their humanity. Because they would have felt humanity hurts, being human hurts, feeling hurts, connection hurts, love hurts. And then as Tim describes, this is how monsters are basically created. So I started to feel a lot of empathy, and I always felt empathy because, I loved a narcopath. And I felt the underlying pain, and I knew that a lot of the cruelty done to me was born through not being able to cope in life and having gone through a horrendous start. But then I was like, hang on a second. This is dangerous right now because I'm falling again into that trap of making justifications and feeling empathy for outright evil. And it's dangerous because what does feeling too much empathy for this create? It can, lead us to soften our heart. It can lead us to extend a helping hand. It can make us feel sorry for them, too sorry, and even a desire to go towards them and forget the danger that they present to us. We often misjudge and we can think that we can get through to the human. But with narcissists and narcopaths, that human form doesn't really exist anymore. Where there should be a person, human being, they're something else. But it isn't human, as you know, and looks will deceive you. They're more like creatures, like I've always said in previous videos, they're quite soulless, if not completely soulless, pretending to be soulful. I think a lot of the time when we talk about the making of a human being, and we do have to consider this subject quite deeply when we've dealt with a narcissist or narcopath, because they force us to confront this through their own lack of a human being. Now, when we all consider a human being, I believe that we're talking about a substance that most of us carry within us. It lives within us. And what does it actually mean to be a real human? It's to have a soul. Now, I can say this is an inbuilt morality, it's a knowledge of right and wrong, and something that stops us from doing serious harm, to other people within reason. There are a lot of nuances here, so, I'm speaking in general. Definitely a consciousness, a conscience, love, a heart center, and the ability to not only feel for yourself, but for others. For me, this seems like a person having a soul. You can feel it. But with narcissists, you don't get the same feelings. And when we describe someone as being soulless, I think we're usually meaning they're heartless. They don't just exhibit, a lack of real human behaviors, but they have the capability and drive to exploit and manipulate others for their own personal gain, as well as having no issue with red rumming, deleting life. So many people talk about NPD as a personality disorder. And when this is done, it focuses basically a lot on the grandiose sense of self and, entitlement, a lack of morality. But rarely do people talk about the more serious side, the more serious implications of being involved with this type of person. The uglier details, I feel, are swept under the rug. Because on the more malignant scale, this is a seriously dangerous person that doesn't hesitate to eliminate anyone and actually quite likes it. And I really feel some people want us to focus on the narcissist's trauma. And even though I do have a deep empathy and compassion, and I say, I'm so sorry that you went through that, but it doesn't give you the right to hurt others to the level that you do. There's lashing out because of pain. And then there's what narcissists and narcopaths do. No action of wrongdoing and knowing hurt to others and enjoyment over that harm is excusable. So just returning now to Tim Fletcher's thought about narcissists, narcopaths, and psychopaths and how they're made through, traumatic environment. I thought, something doesn't quite add up to me. And a question that I'd present is, why do some people become narcissists, but others in traumatic childhood environments do not? Two kids can be in the same household. One develops NPD, and the other one in exactly the same household with exactly the same narcissistic parents becomes an empath. That kind of destroys the idea that NPD and psychopathy are created through children not being given healthy coping mechanisms, right? This is part of it, but this can't be all of it, obviously. In addition to this, as is very obvious, NPD and psychopathy is something that seems to run in families. It is very common, but to say that just because you have the genes of parents or grandparents with NPD or psychopathy, it doesn't mean that it's a given that you're going to have this yourself. People, in my opinion, are using this too much as an excuse, which helps them to justify in their minds what's going on without having the discomfort internally to look any further. A lot of survivors of narcissists, they come to the same conclusion that it seems like some sort of a covenant has been made between the narcissist and, of course, how we know the father of evil in Christianity is Satan. Because you do feel the satanic and demonic forces driving these individuals. And many survivors that have seen and touched that gather the understanding that somehow, at some early point in their life, they seem to have sold their soul. Because where is the human being? Where are they? Another topic within this discussion that's worth noting is that primary psychopaths are born. And there are many studies that have shown that plenty of times these individuals have had perfectly healthy, loving families. They're born into loving families. There's not a history of trauma. There's not a history of narcissists or psychopaths in the family, so it's not genetic. So taking this into account and taking into account, that not all children in highly traumatic early environments without healthy coping mechanisms, given to them, develop NPD. So I believe there's a missing piece here that psychology, can't offer us. Something else is definitely going on. And the reason why psychology can't give us the missing piece is because it's spiritual. For those of you that have watched my previous videos about my demonic encounter with a narcopath and why I believe there are certainly demonic ties and influences, and in some cases, partial or even full possessions, you will know that it's my belief that NPD is a spiritual disorder. I say it all the time. Many survivors of narcissistic abuse, they're going to testify that they came to the same conclusion as me. For just because, basically, we can't see the spiritual in existence, it doesn't mean that it doesn't exist. And many times we can go on merrily through life and then we collide with a narcissist. And at some point, if they're heavily influenced and have a strong demonic attachment and you live with them, sooner or later, you are very likely to notice that something is very strange. So I'd like to give you basically my thoughts on how a narcissist is made, and I want to fill in some of the gaps that I believe are only accessible through spiritual analysis. If we go back to the childhood of narcissists, children, as we know, are very vulnerable, especially those children that are experiencing trauma. Tim Fletcher, he said that the narcissist and the secondary psychopath completely shuts down. And this is where I think the key lies. This is where psychology doesn't journey. We're told that the child shuts down. But my thought was, well, what does that mean? And more importantly, how, by shutting down, are you then quite quickly able to become someone that resembles a human but isn't really a human, and somebody that suddenly becomes, in many cases, evil? And I thought of this because I know of children that have been in terrible trauma, that zoned out and developed fantasy worlds. And they went there to escape, but they never lost touch with love. They never did. They never lost touch with themselves. And psychology can't address, why does this happen to some and not to others? Why do some children go one way and other children go a completely different way? I was watching something from Buffy the Vampire Slayer, and it's something that I want to quote because I found that there's a lot of comparisons to be found between what we went through in narcissistic abuse and the vampire genre. There's some wisdom in there somewhere. And basically, Buffy was talking about a fellow slayer called Faith, and she turned to the dark side in the series, and she killed a human. And that's not something that slayers are meant to do. And she didn't seem to show too much care, remorse. She wasn't bothered, basically. And Buffy, being compassionate, said to her friend Willow, in observation of Faith's background, her childhood, was really tough. She said, probably if I'd been in her shoes growing up, I could have ended up in exactly the same way. And Willow said a great bit of wisdom. She looked at Buffy and she said, you know what, I don't think so, because I think some people just don't have it in them. And I honestly believe, in fact, I go as far as to say, I know that some people do have an inclination more towards evil than others. Does it mean that they can't be corrupted? I wouldn't say that, but I would say that they would be less inclined towards corruption, whereas certain people have more of a natural inclination. So psychology tells us that these children become narcissists and secondary psychopaths because they shut down. And I can feel, yeah, that's truth. I can understand how that happens when the child feels like there is no other choice based on not being able to cope with what's happening in their life. But you see, I'm interested, like I said, in what happens when they shut down. I spoke in my podcast last week, the quote from the Bible, Ephesians, we don't do battle against flesh and blood. And I offered some thoughts from Sri Aurobindo about how disincarnate beings and entities, they come in and they claim possession of a human being. And I'd like to offer another thought from Paramahansa Yogananda this time, because I think it could explain what happens in this process of shutting down. Now, if a person were to keep his automobile unlocked and unoccupied with the key in the ignition, anybody could get in, drive it, and wreck it. Similarly, when the mind is kept blank, any tramp soul may get in and take possession. These tramp souls are roaming through the ether by the millions. Now, tramp souls, Yogananda's talking about hobo spirits, spirits without a home, i.e. a body to inhabit. And not just any spirits, because obviously most move to the light, whereas others, due to their connection to wickedness and their own desire still for evil and to continue to do evil on the earth, they're wishing to gain access to a body again as soon as possible. And they're really not fussy. So they're looking for any vacancy. Now, of course, Aurobindo, from the quotes last week in the podcast that I made a distinction between what Yogananda is describing as a disincarnate spirit, a tramp soul, and with far more dangerous entities, demonic entities that have never incarnated in a body on this earth before, because they refuse to be slaves to matter. And having a body is being a slave to matter. And this is honestly what I believe is going on with narcissists and psychopaths. I believe that there's a whole host of entities influencing and even possessing them. But it's in my belief that the further along the scale that the narcissist becomes into, malignancy, into psychopathy, because there is a scale to this, the further they are into it, the more major league the demons are that are attached to them, and the more dangerous they are. Now, you may realize that it's common to hear about people committing crimes, serious crimes, doing things that they'd never do, and feeling like it wasn't them that actually did it when they were under the influence of a substance, usually drugs, can be alcohol, sometimes both. This, in my opinion, is the same thing as I'm talking about. So the substance offers enough space because at that moment, the person is not fully present. Their automobile is unlocked with the key in the ignition. And it creates the opportunity for entities and disincarnate spirits, to take control in those moments and influence the person's actions. And I remember watching a documentary about Guns N' Roses, Axl Rose. And it's well known, he did a lot of drugs, and people said that in his real life, when he wasn't engaging under the influence of substances, he was a sweet person. He was gentle, kind. But when he would be under the influence, he became a beast. And there was a woman speaking in this documentary, and she had been, assaulted by him sexually, physically in their youth. And I remember her speaking about what he did to her. And she said, in the middle of this moment when he was doing something, all of a sudden, for a few seconds, he came to and he couldn't believe what he was doing. And he saw her hurt and he started crying and he said, "I'm so sorry." He literally didn't know what he was doing. But it didn't last long before he was gone again and he continued to do what he was doing. And this is a reflection. And I know exactly what happened because obviously he came into consciousness again in that moment. But it wasn't him. I believe it wasn't him that was doing those actions. In those moments, I believe he was under the influence not only of alcohol and drugs, but he was under the influence of demonic forces. Now, I've heard many stories of these malignant narcissists having imaginary friends or talking with spirits as children. And apparently one subscriber told me that Sam Vaknin described being overcome by an imaginary friend. And it is common to hear stories from malignant narcissists, by the way, of this happening, speaking to spirits as a child, having friends. And the more that I heard from people, I started to question, who are these spirits and who are these friends? That's why I'm saying children, they do have a vulnerability because they're very open. And of course, this is a big universe. There's both benevolent and malevolent forces out there. The angelic realm is just as real as the demonic. In fact, we know from the Bible that demons are just indeed fallen angels. You know, I firmly believe that some people are born by nature more predisposition towards turning to the dark side, so to speak. Doesn't mean that they will, because there are many children born into trauma, like I said, with narcissistic and psychopathic parents that don't develop NPD. And what is seen is this active fight to keep hold of the light within. They don't want to become corrupted or polluted by darker forces. But some other children in narcissistic families, they do develop NPD as a response to trauma. And it seems to happen quite early on. It's my belief that once there is a foothold for evil and for these entities to work through, it's something that quickly overpowers and rapidly gets out of control. And somebody commented on my previous video, an Ethiopian proverb, really great. Evil enters like a needle and spreads like an oak tree. It's poison to the soul. It's disease and it spreads. And once the malignant narcissist or psychopath gets to a certain point of mental, emotional, and spiritual corruption, there is no coming back from that. They are interwoven, interlocked. They won't let go of their attachments. And as I was saying before, there is something within some people's characters that seems to be more open to persuasion towards that way. And I'm actually going to quote from Star Wars because I think there's a lot of wisdom to be found in that series. Why? Because it gives us a good reflection on soul corruption and what makes people turn away from the path of light and truth. And Yoda actually says, fear is the path to the dark side. He's basically saying that fear is the pathway to evil. And I believe that fear is the origin. You know, it's the original negative emotion where all negative emotions stem from. Life truly is an interplay between those two dualistic forces. And we, just like Yoda, need to master those forces within ourselves and understand that every one of us has a shadow. And it's not to shun it, it's to integrate it within ourselves. Bring the dark aspects to light and become fully embodied and then empowered. We are learning to overcome these forces and not get led astray by them. And even though we could all embrace darkness, we could all get led astray by it, but I don't think that everybody has it in them to truly walk that path to the end. Like I said, there seems to be some sort of a natural inclination for some rather than others. And we can't only take trauma or genetics into it, in my opinion, because there are so many children, as I'm saying, that don't develop NPD. Some kids hold on to love so strongly, they never let it go. They never let it go from within them. But we know that narcissists, they do let go of love, as well as empathy and true connection to their humanity. And I really don't think that we can explain this away under psychology or science, because there are many things that we don't understand, that our microscopes can't reach, and this is one of them. Why does one child fight to keep hold of the light, fight to keep hold of love, but the other doesn't? There has to be something in their character, in their nature, in order for them to do it. And this comes down to a personal level, because they could be siblings or even twins in exactly the same traumatic environment. One remains in touch with who they are as a human being, of love and kindness, and the other one lets go of it. You know, I've likened it before to Gollum in Lord of the Rings, which gives us a great visual image of what happens when somebody becomes corrupt by evil. They become totally deformed. There is very much a mutual attachment, just like Gollum has with the ring. Narcissists, they don't want help, you see. They don't want to change. And honestly, the last thing that the demonic entities in influence over the narcissist want is also help. They despise the light and they want to stay far away from it. And the narcissist and these entities in time become one. They're one and the same. There's no separation. They come as a package deal. Get away because they're going to cause serious harm to anybody that's around them. And it's definitely not an innocent level lashing out because of pain. For those of us that experienced it, we know it's far darker and deeper and it's more sinister than that. And when we think of this only in terms of trauma I think it causes us to believe that there is a person present. You know, there's a person that can be reached by the outside source. Unfortunately, for our protection, as I learned, because my channel is not about hating narcissists, I'm motivated by the desire to protect human life, having almost been destroyed myself. Because I thought that a narcissist was a person, just like me, but one that was in a lot of pain and needed a lot of love and understanding, and boy, was I wrong. And that ignorance almost cost me my life. But the truth is, I'm going to repeat it, evil is not excusable. And plenty of people that have gone through seriously traumatic experiences in their childhoods do not become psychopaths or narcissists, do not have any desire to do harm to others, to take human life, to take pleasure in their destruction. On the contrary, they desire to love. So those are my thoughts for today, and let me know if you resonate by leaving me a comment below. And coming up, I've got some more podcasts for you that you might enjoy. For now, thanks so much for watching. Take care, sending love, and I'll see you all again next week.